Well, welcome to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I am Charles Duran. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of International Relations here at SAIS. We are absolutely delighted to have you participate in this lively discussion of a very important book, Conquered into Liberty, 2 Centuries of Battles Along the Great War Path That Made the American Way of War. We're going to start off with a little explication of what is in the book by its author, Eliot Cohen. And then we're going to have some discussion afterwards, and we hope to have some time for a response to those comments, and maybe even a chance to hear a couple of questions from the floor. Eliot Cohen is the Robert Osgood Professor of Strategic Studies at SAIS. He has served on the policy planning staff of the Office of the Secretary of Defense before coming to SAIS in 1990. He has also been an officer in the United States Army Reserve. From 2007 to 2009, he was counselor of the Department of State, serving as Secretary Condoleezza Rice's senior advisor on strategic issues. And I must not forget, he is also the founding director of the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies here at SAIS. He also has done a lot of things in academia, but I, in fact, didn't add those things in, so we'll have to include that. Our first discussant is Tom Ricks. He is the author of a number of very successful books on the U.S. military, including, for example, these are the titles, Fiasco, The Gamble, Making the Core. All of these have been bestsellers. He has served on the staff of the Wall Street Journal for some 17 years. More recently, he's been with the Washington Post. He is currently a fellow at the Center for New American Security and is a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine, for which he writes the blog, The Best Defense. Finally, our third participant, Nicholas Westerbrook, is an independent historian. He's the author of a number of articles on American history. Between 1989 and 2009, very significantly for this book, he was executive director of Fort Ticonderoga. And of course, this location plays such a very significant role in Eliot Cohen's book. Nicholas Westerbrook previously was curator of exhibits for the Minnesota Historical Society. He is thus really an expert on a number of aspects of locale and setting that are crucial to Conquered into Liberty. Eliot, tell us what your book is about.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's so great to see so many old friends, former students, colleagues, and I appreciate everybody on the panel, particularly my friend Nick Westbrook for making the journey from the North Country to come here. I'll say more thank yous at the very end of this, but let me now just say something about the book. And I suppose I should say, those of you who are standing along the back wall, there are plenty of seats up front. The dean is lonely. You should keep her company. Okay, so in graduate school, like most students of international relations, the past that I studied was the Second World War. And the present was the Cold War and of our conflict with the Soviet Union. From 2007 to 2009, as Professor Duran has told you, I was counselor of the Department of State, and I spent a lot of my time fretting about the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So after leaving government, I came back and finished a book on America's most persistent, effective, and I would argue important enemy of all, Canada. And that is the subject of this book, Conquered into Liberty. It describes how the American way of war originated during almost 2 centuries of conflict with Canada, yes, Canada, because from the end of the 17th century through the first half of the 19th, that northern border of ours was anything but the sleepy, relatively undefended frontier of today. It was rather a zone of raid and menace and invasion. Conquered into Liberty is, moreover, about a particular place, what Native Americans called the Great Warpath, and that's that 200-mile stretch of water and woodland between Albany and Montreal. The book is framed by a series of battles. To give you a feel for that, here's how Chapter 1 opens. At 5 o'clock in the morning on February 9th, 1690, a bleeding man on a wounded horse staggered into the fortified, winter-bound Dutch town of Albany. Despite the bullet in his thigh, Simon Schermerhorn had ridden nearly 20 miles in 6 hours from Schenectady to Albany through knee-deep snow. The mayor, Peter Schuyler, hastily convened a meeting of the aldermen to hear the exhausted Schermerhorn's grim news. Just before midnight on the 8th, a party of French and Indians had stormed Schenectady, killing most of the inhabitants, carrying off others, and setting its houses on fire. In the following days, some 50 survivors of the Schenectady massacre, many suffering from frostbite, trudged their way to Albany. They and their horrified hosts eventually pieced together what had happened. We go from there. The story, the burning of Schenectady by a Franco-Indian raiding party, actually majority French, begins the book's battles, which end with a Confederate raid, yes, a Confederate raid on St. Albans, Vermont in 1864, and a raid into Canada by Irish-American veterans of the Civil War in 1866. Some of the fights I talk about were very big. The attempt in 1758 by the British to storm Fort Carillon, now Fort Ticonderoga, in which nearly 15,000 troops were hurled back with horrific loss by barely a fifth as many Frenchmen. Some of the other fights I talk about were mere skirmishes. Some of these battles were decisive, others were not. But individually and collectively, they reveal a great deal about why the United States wages war the way it does. And that is why each chapter explores how these struggles of long ago are alive and in some ways even visible to Americans today. A word about the title, Conquered into Liberty. I explain it in Chapter 5, which deals with the American invasion of Canada in 1775, launched, I would point out, before the United States had even declared its independence from Great Britain. It is the opening phrase of a subversive pamphlet printed in French by order of the Continental Congress. And this was spread throughout Canada by American agents. And it begins, "You have been conquered into liberty." That's a pretty interesting notion, isn't it? That people can be conquered into liberty. And yet it is an idea that Americans have pursued, sometimes with great success, sometimes with failure, sometimes with uncertain results, for a long, long time, down to the present day. And it started here. In the case of Canada, the Americans failed. It was probably inauspicious that the pamphlet was not widely read because most of the population of Canada were illiterate. And neither the clergy nor the gentry were particularly inclined to put subversive ideas into the heads of the habitants. But the Americans tried hard. George Washington, who had orchestrated this assault while commanding the Continental Army outside Boston, ordered his subordinates to subdue their deep-seated mistrust of the Catholic French. "While we are contending for our own liberty," he wrote in his orders, "we should be very cautious of violating the rights of conscience in others, ever considering that God alone is the judge of the hearts of men, and to him only in this case are they answerable." George Washington was motivated by some very hard-headed notions about power. He favored invading Canada because he wanted to push Britain off the North American continent. But he was actuated by these ideals as well. But by the way, Washington did not want the French back in Canada either, and he was quite willing to double-cross his protege, the Marquis de Lafayette, in order to keep them out, but that's a story in another chapter of the book. I describe Benjamin Franklin's journey